So let's move on to step one. Again, step one is to determine what the other person believes. Columbo Tactic 1. Now, Greg Koukl gives a very good recommendation. It's pretty generic, and I'm just going to repeat it over and over. And I apologize if it's going to be annoying, but what I suggest is rather than it being annoying to you, why don't you repeat it along with me? And Greg Koukl suggests this simple question. What do you mean by that? That's pretty open-ended, but it's a good way to start figuring out. So what we'll do is we'll look at not only how do we apply that question, but for statements that people make, we can follow the same pattern using different phrases. Let's begin. So someone might say all religions are basically the same. So take a second and say, how would you respond to that, trying to understand what they mean? What do they really believe? You could say, what do you mean by that? Or you could say, in what way are they basically the same? And along that vein, you can ask, why are the similarities more important than the differences? The person making this kind of statement may not realize that there are significant differences, and there are concepts in some religions that just can't be reconciled. And so, if they're basically the same, how is it that you can ignore these differences? You could focus it on Jesus, and you can ask, do you think Jesus thought all religions were equal? I'm the way, the truth, and life. No one comes to the Father but through me. Jesus is very exclusive. It isn't that Christianity is exclusive, but Jesus, who's the originator of the religion, is exclusive. You could use the last one as sort of a last resort. I wouldn't recommend it, but you could ask, are aspirin and arsenic basically the same because they both come in tablet form? And the point there is, by analogy, all religions kind of look the same, but when you get down underneath, they're not. So there's a difference like aspirin and arsenic. Again, Columbo Technique 1. What do you mean by that? Somebody says you're intolerant. How would you respond? Well, what do you mean by intolerant? You could ask for detail. In what way specifically is my belief intolerant? And you could also sort of use the judo throw, which is, and by the way, the judo throw is when you use the opponent's argument against them. Do you consider yourself a tolerant or intolerant person when listening to views that are different than yours? You shouldn't force your views on me. Well, what do you mean by that? Or how am I forcing my views on you? Digging down a little, do you respect diverse points of view, or do you condemn others for convictions that differ from your own? 4. It's not rational to believe in God because there's no proof. Well, there's two very ambiguous terms in there. Well, what do you mean by God, since there are many definitions? When we hear that somebody believes in God, one of the questions we ask is that the Christian God? Or is that some other version of God they've created by picking something from one religion and another religion and another religion? They have this concept of God that is definitely not Christian, but is their own concoction. And so you might want to ask the question, what do you mean by God, since there are many definitions? Or what kind of God do you reject, which is similar? So that's one of the words, but the other is rational. What specifically is irrational about believing in God? And another word is proof. What kind of proof would you find acceptable? It may be that there's lots of proof that the person hasn't considered. The Bible has been changed over the years. Well, what do you mean by that? Well, how do you think it's been altered? How much would have to be true for you to consider it? Maybe the Bible has been changed over the years, but maybe the changes are in places that really don't matter. I personally don't believe it's been changed that much. I think that textual criticism has helped us. I think we have a very textually accurate Bible. But again, we're trying to respond not with facts, but with questions. You might want to ask, what archaeological evidence do you have that it's been changed? Again, you have this general statement, but what are the specifics? What archaeological evidence can you point to? And then we also know that the early church fathers wrote letters that either directly or indirectly made references to Scripture, meaning portions of Scripture or sentences in Scripture, quotes. So you could ask, how do you explain all the early Christian letters saying the same thing as the Bible? Meaning that we have this external source that reinforces the historical veracity of the Bible. Well, there is no God. How's that for a statement? How do you respond to that? Well, what do you mean by that? Again, what do you mean by God? And is that a personal opinion or something you think is objectively true? So, and this is an interesting type of response, because now in our culture, people are considering or thinking of religion as something that's a preference and not something that's objectively true. For example, they may think that no religion is true, or it's not possible that any religion is true, in which case choosing a religion is a preference. But that's not the Christian claim. The Christian claim is that there's an external reality that exists. There have been historical events that have occurred, and the historical events point to the truth, the objective truth, the actual truth of Christianity. So you want to ask, is that somebody's opinion, or do they think that there's just it's false? Because opinion is neither false nor true. How could God exist when there's so much evil in the world? Well, what is it about that statement or question that you need to dig into? Well, what in your mind is a conflict? In some sense, it's a non sequitur. It doesn't follow that there's evil, so God doesn't exist. Well, how is that a conflict? What's the tension there? You could ask for clarification. What do you mean by evil? And the last one is sort of digging under this, trying to give the person a hint. Could God have a morally justifiable reason for the way things are? Is there a reason that that there is evil in the world that would justify the existence of that evil? So you're trying to dig into this. You're twisting my words. Well, how could I twist your words? By asking a question. That's just your interpretation. Well, if you were to say, what do you mean by that? That's a good question. What do you mean by just? What do you mean by interpretation? And then why do you think it's just my interpretation? Because maybe I represent the majority of evangelicals. Maybe I represent the majority of scholarship with my view. Dig into it. Why do they think? What are their sources? Here's one that's interesting that I've actually heard. The fetus may be a human being, but it's not a person. So you read that and you go, what do you mean by that? Well, really, what is the difference between a human being and a person? And if it is a human being, then why isn't abortion murdering a human being? Very strange.